Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for coming to our first seminar for the Environment, Ecology, and Energy program, E3P. We're really excited this semester. Sorry for the confusion with the time change, but we're going to be now having our seminars at 12 o'clock on Thursdays, and we'll have the schedule coming out soon. It should be up today. So really excited to have Dr. Koerner here. She is a new professor in her second year at UNC Greensboro. She's working on climate change and grasslands. She started as an undergrad at Clemson, did her PhD at the University of New Mexico, and then has done multiple postdocs, one which is down the road at Duke University. So she's really excited to be here. I'm really excited that she's here, and she'll be talking about plant diversity responses to global change.
Thanks, and thank you all for all coming today and for the invite over here. I am new to UNCG and so eager to meet people in the area and hear about what is going on in other schools close by. So it's nice to get to come and talk to my neighbors a little bit and tell you about what I am working on at UNCG. So this is going to be kind of a small part, well, it's a big part of my research, but at several sites. I do work here in North Carolina as well, which is new to me, in longleaf pine systems. And I also do work out in Montana and Wyoming. But today I'm going to focus in on a lot of my work that deals with large herbivores in grasslands and what happens when we lose them from the system. So grasslands or savannas cover over 41% of the terrestrial surface. So they are a major component of every continent except for Antarctica. And when I talk about grasslands today, I really just mean any system that is grass dominated. So this will include savannas as well as grasslands. So I'm kind of using it as a general term. And grasslands are important because they sequester large amounts of carbon, so they're important for global carbon cycles, and then also they're economically important, both in terms of grazing lands, which is how we use most of our grasslands here in the US, but then also in terms of tourism, because they are home to many of the world's remaining charismatic megafauna. So today I'm going to tell you 3 different stories, which are all related. The first is going to be about 2 specific sites dealing with the loss of herbivores and how it interacts with fire. The second is going to look at the loss of herbivores in a meta-level analysis with sites from all over the globe. And the third is going to focus in just on that single site in South Africa and how it, grazing and fire interact with climate change, or a large climate event. So most grasslands are dominated by grass. This is probably something that everyone would guess, and it would be relatively obvious. But then they also have this forb component, which is the wildflowers. And in this system and in this talk today, we're going to kind of think about the grass as being the primary contributor to biomass. So that's where the bulk of the plants come from. And then the forbs are really what's contributing a lot of the diversity. This is not a hard and fast rule across grasslands, but for the most part, this tends to be true. And a lot of what I think about is this interplay between grass abundance and forb richness. And oftentimes they're negatively related to each other. So how do different drivers, how does global change influence that dynamic in the system? So the 3 major drivers of a lot of grassland systems are fire, grazing, and precipitation. Fire tends to be fairly frequent in savannas and grasslands. It's one of the, or the most frequently burned ecosystem or biome, with on average there being a 2 to 3 year fire return interval. Fire tends to increase light availability, right? When you go in and you remove all of that dead biomass, a lot more light can reach the soil surface, and it also tends to homogenize the plant community. So this is a study I did actually during my dissertation, and you can see here that annually burned grassland tends to be less heterogeneous, so less patchy, and also we saw a decrease in forb richness. So again, to summarize, biomass goes up when you burn, and forb diversity or richness tends to go down. Now that second major driver, grazing. So all grasslands have herbivores, no matter where they are. A lot of places, it's just left to the insects, but then there's also a lot of small mammals that can eat the plants, and then things like bison as well. And today, when I talk about herbivory and talk about grazing, the only thing that I'm presenting on today is these large mammals, which tend to be grazers in my field sites. And most grasslands are, in fact, grazed by some sort of large grazer. When I like to think about grasslands, I tend to think about these African savannas where there's zebra and wildebeest roaming, but most of our grasslands here in the US also have herbivores. They're just cattle. They are domestic herbivores that we have put onto the land. Grazing tends to increase the patchiness or the heterogeneity of the system because these herbivores go in and selectively consume what they want to eat and what they don't. So in this same study, you can see that grazing tends to increase heterogeneity, more patches, decrease grass cover, and increase forb diversity. So grazing tends to have the opposite effect of fire, right? Decreasing abundance of grass and increasing forb diversity. And the last driver is precipitation, right? Precipitation controls how much soil moisture is available to the plants. And this has been shown many, many times to be very tightly linked to both productivity and richness. This is kind of one of the classic grassland examples from Osvaldo Sala, where he was looking at sites spread out across precipitation gradient, and so their mean annual precipitation down on the x-axis, and you can see that as you have more water, you have more plant biomass. You can also see this within a single site. So this is an experiment out in tallgrass prairie in Kansas, where you have plots that were watered and plots that were not. And you can see that in all of those years, for the most part, where you watered, you had more plant biomass. The same was true for richness on a small scale. So the irrigated plots, on average, tend to have more species than the control plots that received ambient rainfall. So precipitation tends to have this positive effect on both diversity and biomass in the system. So this is kind of the conceptual framework that I work in, what controls the different aspects of the plant community and grassland system. But a lot of this research comes from North American mesic grasslands. And so this kind of leads to two big questions about this and whether or not we believe this is how the world works. The first is, it's all changing, right? So global change is happening and it's affecting all three of these drivers at the same time. So just because we knew it to be true in the past doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's going to happen moving forward, as all of these are drastically altered. And the second thing is, are all grasslands the same? I showed you they cover 41% of the terrestrial surface. Do these same rules apply across all of these different grasslands? Or is what happens here in North America very different from someplace like South Africa? And a lot of research has been going on recently that say that, in fact, each grassland is a little bit different, and we can see this through something like herbivory, the effects of herbivores on richness. It varies across the entire globe, with many studies showing that herbivores increase richness, many other studies showing there's no effect, and different studies showing that, in fact, there's a negative effect, and herbivores can make richness go down. And the current hypothesis, or the prevailing theory, of why we see these disparate responses is because of what the site productivity is. So is it a mesic grassland or a xeric grassland in these systems? And so if we were to look at this, this is a change in richness from the loss of grazing. So what happens when you take herbivores out of the system? How will richness respond? And you can see here, if there was no change, you would get this flat kind of zero line. And the idea is that we should see this negative relationship. And that's because at the high end, where you have high productivity, you have very, very tall grasses. And when the herbivores come in, they eat those tall grasses down and open up a lot of light availability. So in the mesic end, herbivores tend to increase richness. So when you lose those herbivores, it has a negative impact on richness. On the flip side, in those low productivity environments, they tend to be relatively harsh to begin with. The plants are struggling to get the water that they potentially need, and The herbivores are also not having necessarily enough forage, so they're selecting for the really nutritious plants, so they're not wasting energy on other things. So when you take herbivores away from the system, you tend to get this kind of like stress relief, and so the plants do better, and in fact, there's more diversity. And there have been, as I mentioned, several studies that have come out that have shown this pattern to hold. So looking at different grassland sites across a productivity gradient, what happens when you remove herbivores, and they've shown very similar patterns to this. But in my experience, this does not always hold true. So the first story I'm going to tell you about is this case study where this was not the answers that we saw. It doesn't fit with the prevailing theory. Oops. And I want to just go ahead and start at the beginning of each one of these stories and mention that there have been lots of collaborators on all of the research I do. These are long-term studies, and without them, this analysis would not be possible. So we did this at 2 field sites. We started this project in 2006, and we compared a site in North America in tall grass prairie, which is in Kansas, with the Konza Prairie LTER. Here is a picture of one of my friends. He's over 6 feet tall, and you can see that grass is over its head when it's bolting. So these are, in fact, very tall grass prairies. The other site was in Kruger National Park in South Africa. You can see, again, in this picture that the grass is actually quite high. Again, these are mesic systems with a lot of productivity. And the question here that we went in when we started this experiment was, do the same drivers have the same impact on the 2 different continents, right? They're worlds away from each other, and do they respond the same? So there are some similarities which are really important in these 2 sites, which I want to point out first. The first is that they have similar growing season precipitation and similar productivity. So again, these are both very productive and mesic systems, right? And you can see here, this is from 10 years of data that we collected at our 2 field sites, and they're pretty much on par with each other in terms of how productive they are. And the second thing is that they are home to long-term fire experiments and large native herbivores. And so the combination of having both of these is actually relatively rare. There aren't many places in the world where you have both of those things. And so that is why we picked these 2 sites to work at. Now, as you might guess, they are also very different. The first thing is that the North American grasslands are quite a bit younger in an evolutionary standpoint, whereas the South African grasslands are quite a bit older. And then also they have different numbers of current mega herbivores or large herbivores. So in North America, there are deer, but primarily what we're working with are bison. So that's our major grazer in this system. And then our site in South Africa has the full suite of herbivores that are found in that area. So what we decided to do was to go in and figure out how these herbivores interact with fire to affect the plant community, and really trying to figure out, do they do the same thing in these 2 different systems? So we built these large exclosures to keep the herbivores out, and we did it in 3 different burn treatments. So there were annually burn, an intermediate burn, which is about 3 to 4 year fire return, and then an unburned or kind of a control fire area. So we ended up with 63 exposures in both of the 2 continents. And we, of course, went and sampled the plants inside of them. We have permanent plots that we go back to year after year. We're still going back to these same plots inside the exclosure, and then we have a grazed paired plot. So what we can compare, they're within about 20 meters of each other, what's happening inside versus what's happening outside. And when we started the experiment, we preferentially chose plots that were very similar to each other for the inside and outside comparisons. And we predicted that the removal of large herbivores, remember these are in that productive area of this graph here, right? The prevailing theory. Both of these sites are down here in this very productive end of the system. And so we predicted that when we removed herbivores, we would see an immediate and a strong decrease in richness. And since our sites are the exact same productivity for the most part, we predicted that they would do the exact same thing.
Could you quickly comment on how much bare ground there was in that previous picture relative to the asserted high productivity?
This one here?
Yeah.
So this was, in fact, actually a drought year. And towards the very beginning, this is not what it looks like most of the time. And this is actually a picture from another site. We have them across a productivity gradient as well. So this was really more for illustration purposes. And so this is what we found. So I'm just going to dive right into the data. So this is the difference in richness across the 3 different burn treatments. And really, for this part of the talk, most of the burn treatments behaved the same. So I'll kind of condense it down and gloss over the interaction with fire. And what you can see is that almost immediately we saw a strong decrease in richness. Kanza behaved exactly as theory would predict. And if you look at Kruger, it did not. So these sites did not respond the same way at all. And in fact, Kruger was really resistant to the loss of herbivores. Not much changed in the plant community, nor did we see a big decrease in richness. And just to kind of dive into that a little bit, we think it's due to how the species shifted in response to the loss of herbivores. So this is at Kanza, our North American site, and we're just looking at a rank abundance curve. So this is the most abundant species, and this is how much abundance it had. So it was about 20% of the plant community. It's Andropogon jardii, or big blue stem, which we do have here in North Carolina as well. And you can see when these systems are annually grazed, it's about 20%, and you take the herbivores away, and Andropogon takes off and takes over, essentially. And so now it becomes almost 65% of the plot's abundance. On the flip side, if you look at Kruger, you can see that the most abundant species, Bothrioclo radicans, is about 40%. You take herbivores away, and Bothrioclo radicans is about 40%. So this dominant species doesn't really seem to care if herbivores are there or not. We also found, looking across all years and all plots, and this holds for the other burn treatments as well, that dominance tended to be negatively correlated with richness. So all dominance is, and the dominance metric we use, which is Berger-Parker, is the abundance of that species. So dominance for this plot would have been 65, right? Whereas dominance in this plot would have been 20, it's a much lower number. So when you compare those across all of our plots, across all years, you see this strong relationship. And this was even true at Kruger as well. But at Kruger, dominance was not impacted by the loss of herbivores. So at Kanza, you see a huge increase in dominance, and at Kruger, you see no change in dominance. And so we think that's why we're seeing this very different pattern happening at these 2 sites. And in part, it's because of who is dominant. So this grass here, this Bothrioclo radicans, the nickname or the common name is stinky grass. So when you crush it up, it kind of smells like pine sol a little bit, but the herbivores don't really want to eat it. It's high in tannins, and so they tend to avoid it, and therefore if you remove them, it doesn't really do anything. There hasn't been a large grazing pressure on this grass. Whereas this grass up here, Andropogon jardii, the bison love it, and they preferentially choose to eat it. So from this experiment, what we really learned was that at Kanza, there was a huge increase in grass dominance. So this is a picture from year 7 of the experiment, and you can see exactly what happens in this system. This is all grazed, inside the fence is not. And so there's a lot of light competition happening there, right? The Andropogon is out competing a lot of those form species. And even though in Kruger, dominance and richness were still negatively correlated, the herbivore exclusion really failed to have this effect, right? It didn't really change dominance. And so what we were really interested in about this was the fact that these 2 grasslands responded completely differently, but we think it's this same kind of underlying rule of how dominance impacts richness, right? So richness is responding to dominance in the same ways, but potentially these drivers, the loss of herbivores, is doing different things to dominance. And so this is kind of the, what I'll call the old theoretical framework, which we're trying to shift a little bit. where these sites behaved on a precipitation or a productivity gradient, right? With grazing causing a decrease in plant diversity where it's arid and more stressful, and grazing causing an increase in plant diversity in those more mesic systems. And what we're kind of arguing is that, in fact, this precipitation productivity gradient, while it may work in some places, isn't going to be a great universal rule because it doesn't work in all places. And instead, we need to incorporate how herbivory changes dominance in these systems. And so that first story I told you about really led us to this idea that we have to test this, right? We've done it at 2 sites, but grasslands cover 41% of the terrestrial surface. 2 isn't actually that many. And so we decided to do a meta-level analysis, and I created the loss of grazing database. So in order to be part of this database, I asked the scientific community to contribute data that had herbaceous dominated systems, so any grassland or savanna system. They had to have paired grazed and ungrazed plots so we could compare the effects of grazers. We also had to have exclosures that had been up for at least 3 years so that it gave the plant community time to respond to the manipulations. And then they had to have species level data. So just having richness wasn't enough. It had to be on a species level so we could convert it into some sort of relative abundance. So some people had pin hit count, some people had biomass, some people had cover of composition. But all of them were then converted to relative abundance. And overall, we have 252 data sets in our database where we have the raw species count data from all of these, and over half of them are temporal, where we have more than 3 years with them. But for today, I'm just going to tell you about what we have in the last year of whatever whatever we have from these different sites. And this paper is actually in press right now, which is very exciting, just as of last week. And I want to start by thanking all of the people who are a member of this consortium, because without people being willing to share this data, we would not be able to do these large-scale meta-analyses. And there are over 83 people in the consortium that have contributed data to this. So we have a great spread of sites. We have them on these 5 areas, and we have a pretty good number in each of these different continents. And then within that, we have a nice spread of the precipitation or the productivity gradient in these systems. And so the first question is the prevailing theory correct, right? In my 2 sites, it wasn't, but maybe Kruger is just this really weird outlier and everything else falls into line, right? So the first question is to just say, let's take our 252 sites and let's plot this relationship and see if this is actually what we see across all of the sites. And so when we do that, this is with the sites that had a measure of AMPP, which is only about 132, I believe, sites in this one. And you can see that the relationship is there. It's significant, but almost everything is significant when you have 132 sites. And the R-squared is relatively low. So if we use precipitation instead of productivity, so we're using precipitation here as a proxy for how productive the system could be, you can see, so this is all 252, and in fact, the relationship is not significant and really kind of falls apart. So that is prevailing theory when we test it with our database. But our theory, right, is that the change in dominance is actually what's underlying the richness response. So now we're going to test our theory, where it's the same exact y-axis, but the x-axis changes from production to change in dominance here from the loss of grazing. So over here would be when dominance goes up when you remove an herbivore. So this kind of side is, think of as Kanza, where we saw that huge increase in dominance. And when you plot this, you see a much better relationship. So we've got the effect of herbivores on dominance, and you can see that it is, again, really significant, and our R-squared goes up quite a bit. So we think this is really strong evidence to suggest that potentially this change in dominance is a better universal mechanism than potentially the productivity y-axis that people have been using. Now, we also know that many, many things go into impacting how grazing influences diversity. Things like grazing pressure, right? If you overgraze a system, even in a productive area, it's going to tend to have a negative effect on it. So we included a lot about the herbivore community here in orange. So how many herbivores are there, right? So Kruger had 14 herbivores, Kanza had 1. Did that have an effect? Domestication, so were they wild or native herbivores, or were they things like cows? Grazing pressure and feeding guild. So basically, was there browsers present as well as grazers? And so what you can see here, this is a structural equation model, which we have really good support for. And you can see precipitation feeding into AMPP. So how wet it is does in fact control the biomass that you get. But you can see in this structural equation modeling that AMPP or productivity has no effect on the change in richness that we see. So if prevailing theory or current theory was correct, this would be a really significant relationship. But in fact, that is not a significant relationship, and instead we see a strong relationship in the change in dominance controlling how richness responds. So in fact, we think that this precipitation productivity gradient is not what is a good universal driver. It might work in some systems, in some occasions, but if you're really trying to look at global patterns, you have to think a little bit more mechanistically and think about how the change in dominance occurs with these herbivores. And in fact, what we think this is incorporating is a grazing tolerance or avoidance of dominance. So it's about the dominant species and the traits of that dominant species. There could be several dominant species or co-dominant species as well. And so by thinking about the traits of these grasses that are controlling a lot of the ecosystem function and potentially controlling a lot of the other diversity responses, we really are integrating 2 major players that lots of research has shown is important in this. So the plant traits incorporate the productivity gradient, right? If a plant is in a mesic system or a really productive system, it's going to be a tall grass, right? The plant traits, change across a productivity gradient, but it also incorporates this other really important point of evolutionary history. So these sites in South Africa, or our single site in South Africa, we had a grass species that had evolved to avoid grazing, right? It put a lot of energy and effort into making those tannins so that the herbivores would not eat it, right? And that could potentially be because it's had so long to evolve these traits, whereas our sites in North America are much younger and potentially haven't had the same amount of time. So by thinking about the plant traits specifically of the dominant species, we can incorporate both of these 2 really important points. So let's go back to this first story and think for just a minute about the traits of these 2 different species. Remember, I told you that this one really likes to be, well, it doesn't like to be eaten. The herbivores really like to eat it. The bison go out of their way to selectively choose to eat big blue stem, and the opposite is true for Bothria cloa radicans. They avoid it at all costs, and really even, this is kind of in the dead of winter here. It's not a super clear picture, but even then the herbivores tend to avoid it even when there's not much else that is there. Okay, so let's go to that third thing, the third story, and just focus in on only the site at Kruger, where we have this dominant stinky grass, right, that is completely unpalatable. It's very low forage quality. It's very long-lived. It's a perennial species, so it can live many, many years, and very resistant to grazing and fire. So we have over 10 years of data. I think it's on this next slide. Yes, we have 10 years of data looking at these plant communities. So this is an ordination. So dots that are close in here are, if they're close to each other, they're more similar plant communities. And as they spread out, they become more different from each other. And you can see here, the purple is grazed, the gray is ungrazed. And in our annual burn, there's really no difference between grazed and ungrazed. Intermediate, the same thing. In the unburned, you start to see a little bit of separation, but it's only significant in some years and not in all. So the effects are kind of transient a little bit. And And these are plotted on separate panels, but they are in the same ordination space. So you can see that really the annual and the intermediate are kind of overlapping in the space that they exist in, whereas the unburned is slightly different. But here is what we got the last year that we went. Okay, so for the first 10 years where we were looking at these plots, grazing really didn't have that big of an influence. Fire was like kind of important, but not really super exciting. And instead, when we went back, all of a sudden there was this huge change in the system, a massive change to the system. And so what happened in between this dot and this dot was a massive drought. It's actually categorized as an exceptional drought, which is even beyond extreme. So here is the standardized precipitation index here, where 0 would mean it would be a normal year. Anything between 1 and -1 is also kind of normal, right? Slightly wet, slightly dry, but still really normal. When you get in between 1 and 2, it's dry, and when you get below 2, it's a big drought. And you can see here that there have been small peaks of drought, but this one in 2015 and 2016 was in fact exceptional. It's the biggest one that we have seen and that is in this record of rainfall. So here is the just the severity of that drought, which kind of takes into account any peak below 2 and how deep the peak is and how wide the peak is. So it's basically integrating the area past 2. And you can see through time, we seem to be getting more and more severe droughts. We went ahead and fit a line through here just because it looks alarming. But my guess is that, in fact, that this is not going to continue to increase at this steep of an incline. But it is just to show you that they have been happening. They are in the record, but this is kind of something unlike what we have seen. Then this third panel down here is showing EVI, which is similar to NDVI. But so we're kind of looking at a greenness level. And really what we just wanted to show was that this extreme drought here overlaps with these two bar points to show that, in fact, this is having a really negative impact on the plant community as well. So biomass production went down significantly in those years. So we already talked kind of about what happened in this 2006 through 2014, right? With Kruger not really showing any effect of herbivores in the system. Then we have 2015 and 16, which is the major drought. And then we went back, and the data that I have for you today is kind of comparing this grassland in 2017 to the grassland in the years before, right? So did this drought fundamentally change the system that we have? And what we think is the answer is yes. And it is in part what happened to that stinky grass, that dominant species, Botryacloa radicans. So what we're looking at here, let's just focus in on the annual burn to begin with. And you can see that the solid line is inside the exclosures and the dotted line is the grazed plots. And the two different colors are two different species. So this pink is Botryacloa radicans and the blue is Uricloa mozambicensis. And you can see that for all the years prior, Botryacloa was just kind of bopping around, but it was relatively dominant. Uricloa was an important player in the system, but it was never the dominant species. But then we went back in 2017, Uricloa is the most abundant grass that we have, and Botryacloa has decreased quite drastically. And this holds true for all the burn treatments, but is less pronounced as you decrease burn frequency. So we're seeing this big shift in the system from this unpalatable grass species to one that is quite palatable, which is the Uricloa mozambicensis. So it's actually a good forage species for a lot of the herbivores out in Kruger. So now if we go and we look at those rank abundance curves again, what I really want you to focus in first is the pink dot. So that's Botryacloa radicans. You can see it was about 30% of all of our plots beforehand, and after the drought, it was at about 10. So it got really knocked back by the drought, and this was the same in the intermediate and the same in the unburned, but again, to a lesser extent as you decrease burn frequency. right? So this is a species that is incredibly resistant to grazing and fire, and we saw really no effect of either of those treatments on it. But then a massive drought comes along, and this species actually shows quite intolerance to severe lack of water. The other thing I want to point out here is what's actually happening down in the unburned area, where here we have the first 4 or 5 species really being different grasses. So the green is different grass species, whereas the purple is forb species. And then after the fact, you again see grass species. And this will have a little bit to do with one of the next figures I'm going to show. So unlike in the first story that I told you about, where I kind of said, fire doesn't really do that much, it has the same effects. Now fire becomes incredibly important in this story. Okay, so before the drought, this is pre-drought data only, in our ungrazed only plots as well. You can see that the annual and the intermediate, again, they're really overlapping in space. Their plots are very similar to each other, with the unburned being slightly outside. And this is a significant difference between annual and intermediate are the same, and then the unburned is significantly different from both, right? And so this plant community fire has created different plant communities. This isn't necessarily a new concept at all. Fire can strongly influence plant communities. And in one way in which they're different is that the unburned has a very even grass community, right? It had several of those co-dominant grasses that all had relatively high abundances, unlike the, let's see here, where we had one grass species that was 30% and then much lower cover of number 2. Here we have grass species that are really co-dominating this system, right? So in these 10 years before, we've learned things about the community to give us this idea that the unburned is definitely different than the other 2 burn frequencies. And so one of the things that we were most surprised about, and I was most surprised about, was that, you know, we went in 2015 and 2016, and this is the growing season. This is the middle of the growing season. It was an extreme drought. It was actually really devastating to kind of see. This place I'd been going to for 10 years, there were a lot more animal carcasses that weren't able to survive the drought. The buffalo in particular did really, really poorly in this drought. And we went back in 2017, and biomass was exactly the same as it was the year before the drought. So here we're looking at the change in AMPP, so it's a log response ratio of before versus after, right? And so since these overlap with 0, there's really no change in before versus after. And I really figured that this moonscape would just not really be able to recover after the fact. And what's really interesting is that the 3 different burn treatments were able to recover, but in different ways. So if we just look at grass biomass, you can actually see that in the annual and the intermediate, grass biomass actually went down substantially so, and forb biomass went up, right? So that's a really different system, right? If you go from being grass dominated, which is what a lot of grazers want to eat, and then all of a sudden you have the same amount of biomass there, but now it's forb species, it's wildflowers out there instead of grasses. Whereas on the other hand, you have your, in your unburned plots, in your control plots, you see that you have the same forb biomass and the same grass biomass as you had before. And the reason why we think this is a beam plot. So this is showing the species that did poorly in yellow to the left, and the species that did well in blue. And the first thing you can see is that most species before versus after didn't actually change. Okay? Most of them just came back and had the same abundance. But some of them did really, really poorly. They just disappeared after the drought, and almost all of those were grasses. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. This is, oh, did I say that right? This is grasses, and this is forbs in blue. So you can see that the grasses did really poorly, and in the annual and the intermediate, that is true for both, but they were replaced by forb species, right? So that's how those 2 burn treatments were able to compensate and to recover after the drought. Whereas in the unburned treatment, you see that we still had grasses that did really poorly, but we instead had grasses that also came in and did well, right? So in the annual and intermediate, you had forbs that were compensating, and in the unburned, you had other grasses that were coming in and compensating. And we think that is because of the evenness of the grass community. So if you just take a regression of evenness, pre-drought evenness of the grass community and how much the change in grass, or how big of a change in grass occurred, you can see that when the communities were more even, they were significantly able to kind of bounce back in terms of grass biomass out there. And that's potentially because some grasses did okay and some grasses didn't, but they were able to make up for each other in those instances. Whereas the annual and intermediate just didn't have very many abundant grasses that could come in and bounce back from this. So here is that first figure I showed you with Kanza doing something that we would predict and Kruger doing something that we haven't. But again, we think this no change was because of Bothriocloa, and now Bothriocloa is gone. And so we are hoping to go back and continue monitoring these plots. We went back in 2018 and we're planning on going back in 2019 as well. But our hypothesis is that now we're actually going to see a big shift, right? Because the dominant species in these plots is now a palatable species, right? And so now we might predict that we would see the same thing that has happened at Kanza. So, you know, we've been talking a lot about how do all these grasslands respond, and some sites do this and some sites do that, and fire doesn't matter except for when it interacts with drought, and then it becomes really important. And so you might be thinking to yourself, each one of these grasslands is unique. It's a special flower, it's a unique snowflake, right, that has its own set of requirements and needs and responses to these different systems. But in fact, I think it's really interesting that one of the things that we found throughout all these studies is that how the dominant responds to these different global changes often drives the responses that we see, right? So these dominant species, or the dominant response, is really controlling the rest of the community dynamics and the ecosystem functions that we're seeing. And so if we can just focus in on the traits of those dominant species and understand how the dominant itself is going to respond to global change, we might actually be able to predict grassland responses as a whole and be able to look for some ecological generalities across the entire globe. And so with that, I want to thank my funding sources, as well as these long-term collaborators. As I said, this is work that I've actually been doing since 2006, which is the very start of graduate school, and is still continuing on today. So we've had a nice string of funding sources to help us do that. And then I also kind of want to do a little shameless plug. So I am only in my second year here at UNCG, and we are growing, which is a very exciting time to be. But I am looking for both master's and PhD students to start next year, and technicians and a postdoc as well. So if anybody's interested or knows anybody that's interested in this type of research, send them away. And if there's time, I can take some questions. That's